In Charleston's towering courthouse, once heroic Officer Brent Maddox faces a trial that could shatter his legacy. But beneath the polished suit sits a man boiling with rage, his eyes fixed on Judge Vanessa Rhodess, the black woman he blames for his downfall. As witnesses expose his darkest secrets, tension erupts, and the line between justice and chaos thins. What happens inside this courtroom will shock an entire nation. If this moment felt intense, prepare yourself, because what comes next is darker, more dangerous, and far more powerful than anything you've seen so far. Subscribe to Black Battles and hit the bell icon so you never miss our latest powerful stories. The Charleston Federal Courthouse stood like a fortress of marble and shadow, its towering pillars casting long lines across the steps where reporters gathered in restless clusters. Inside, tension lingered in the air like the static before a storm. Everyone had come to see the trial of Officer Brent Maddox, a man once hailed as a hero, now accused of betrayal, corruption, and abuse of power. For years, Maddox had been the golden name in law enforcement, the officer who led daring raids, who posed proudly for photographs beside politicians and chiefs. His reputation was carefully polished, the kind of legend that inspired new recruits and reassured citizens. But the image had cracks. Beneath the medals and news clippings was a man who thrived on control, who believed the badge placed him above accountability. Now, as he entered the courtroom in a tailored suit rather than a uniform, his confidence was unshaken. Maddox carried himself not like a man on trial, but like someone forced to endure a nuisance. His broad shoulders and sharp gaze swept across the crowded chamber with disdain. He noticed the reporters scribbling, the citizens watching him with suspicion, the victims' families sitting stiffly in the gallery. None of them mattered to him. His focus was locked on one figure, Judge Vanessa Rhodess. She entered with the calm precision of someone who had walked this path for nearly 2 decades. Her black robe flowed with quiet authority, her expression neither warm nor cold, but unyielding. To Maddox, her very presence felt like an insult. A black woman presiding over his case, his fate, was something he could not stomach. His jaw tightened, his resentment burning hotter than the charges stacked against him. Judge Rhodess had seen countless defendants, from petty thieves to hardened criminals, but Maddox was different. There was an arrogance about him, a refusal to acknowledge the gravity of the trial. She had heard whispers about his reputation, how he bent rules, how complaints against him vanished, how colleagues shielded him. Yet she also knew the weight of this moment. If justice faltered here, it would falter everywhere. As the gavel struck, the courtroom fell silent. The opening proceedings began with the prosecution outlining the case, falsified reports, missing evidence, and the testimony of those who claimed their lives had been destroyed by Maddox's abuse of power. Murmurs rippled through the audience, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding as if long-awaited truths were finally surfacing. Maddox sat back in his chair, smirking faintly, whispering to his lawyer. He ignored the eyes of grieving parents staring at him from the gallery. He ignored the reporters capturing every flicker of his expression. To him, the trial was a stage, and he was determined to play the role of the untouchable officer who would never be brought down. But Judge Rhodess saw more than bravado. She saw the cracks in his mask, the anger simmering, the entitlement refusing to bend. In her heart, she knew this trial was more than the downfall of one officer. It was the test of whether truth could pierce through years of silence. And as the first witness prepared to take the stand, the storm that had been building inside the courtroom was only beginning to break. Judge Vanessa Rhodess sat poised behind the elevated bench, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood. To the crowded courtroom, she looked every bit the embodiment of calm authority. But beneath her steady composure was the weight of a decision that stretched far beyond one man's guilt or innocence. This was not merely the trial of Officer Brent Maddox. It was a trial of the system that had shaped and shielded him. For nearly 2 decades, Judge Rhodess had carried the robe as both an honor and a burden. She had seen the best and worst of humanity within the walls of a courtroom. She had sent violent men away, restored dignity to victims, and defended the innocent. But Maddox was different. He wasn't some faceless criminal plucked from the streets. He had been celebrated as a hero. His downfall was a public reckoning, and she knew every decision she made would be scrutinized by those who doubted her strength, her fairness, even her right to sit in that chair. Her father's words echoed in her memory. Justice is never easy, Vanessa. If it were, the world wouldn't need judges, it would need calculators. He had been a civil rights lawyer, a man who endured threats, ridicule, and long nights fighting against injustice. It was from him that she had learned that justice often came at a painful cost. From her bench, she observed Maddox closely. He sat like a coiled spring, leaning back in his chair with his chin lifted, his arms crossed with a defiant ease. His lawyer whispered urgently into his ear, urging restraint, but Maddox barely acknowledged him. He did not see himself as a man accused. He saw himself as a man cornered, waiting for his moment to strike back. The prosecution called its first witness, a grieving mother whose son had been killed in a raid Maddox had led. Her voice trembled as she described the night officers stormed her home, how her son was shot before she could even understand what was happening. Tears streaked her face, and her pain filled every corner of the silent chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail. Spectators leaned forward, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others wiping their eyes. The atmosphere grew heavy, almost suffocating. Maddox's reaction, however, was chilling. He shifted in his seat, rolling his eyes, smirking faintly as if the woman's words were a rehearsed play. He whispered something under his breath, causing his lawyer to stiffen. Judge Rhodess caught it, the disdain, the arrogance, and it only deepened her resolve. She knew Maddox believed he was untouchable. He believed the shield of his uniform, even stripped away, still protected him. But she also knew that the community beyond those marble walls was watching. Families seeking justice, officers seeking redemption, and citizens who had lost faith in the system. They were all waiting to see if the truth would finally triumph. As the mother stepped down, her tears still visible, Judge Rhodess struck the gavel lightly. "Order," she said firmly, her voice calm but commanding. She could feel the storm building, and she braced herself. For this trial was not just about a man who had fallen from grace. It was about whether justice itself could rise in his place. The third day of the trial dawned with restless energy. Reporters lined the courthouse steps before sunrise, cameras ready to capture any detail. Inside, the marble corridors hummed with whispers about what new revelations would surface. Charleston had not seen a trial of this magnitude in decades, and the anticipation grew heavier with every passing hour. In the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Judge Vanessa Rhodess entered with her usual quiet authority, the gavel striking to call the session to order. She surveyed the chamber, packed again with citizens, journalists, and families. But her gaze inevitably returned to Brent Maddox. He sat upright, his jaw rigid, his stare unflinching. His arrogance had not wavered, but Rhodess could see the cracks forming. The prosecution called its next witness, a shopkeeper, a quiet man with tired eyes who testified how Maddox had framed him for possession when he refused to pay protection money. The shopkeeper's voice wavered at first, but as he recounted the humiliation of being dragged away in handcuffs in front of his children, his words gained strength. Maddox leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly. His fingers tapped on the table, impatient, almost mocking. He whispered to his lawyer, loud enough that the jury could hear fragments. "Ridiculous! Making things up!" His lawyer stiffened, clearly aware that such behavior only painted his client in a darker light. When the defense cross-examined, Maddox's smirk grew as though certain the witness would crumble under pressure. But the shopkeeper held his ground, recounting how the charges had eventually been dropped when the evidence mysteriously disappeared. The gallery stirred with murmurs. This was not just misconduct, this was manipulation. Next came testimony from a young woman, a former trainee officer who had once idolized Maddox. She revealed how she had been pressured into falsifying reports under his supervision. Her voice broke as she admitted her guilt, but she insisted that Maddox had made her believe it was the way things were done. Tears streamed down her face as she described the fear of speaking out, The constant reminder that Maddox was untouchable. This time, Maddox could not contain himself. He slammed his palm against the defense table, his voice rising. Lies! She's weak! She was never cut out for this job. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Judge Rhodess immediately struck the gavel. Order! Officer Maddox, you will control yourself or be removed from this courtroom. Her voice was calm but cut like steel. For a moment, Maddox's face twisted in rage, his body tense as though he might rise. His lawyer gripped his arm, urging him to sit. Slowly, Maddox leaned back, muttering curses under his breath. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the flash of his temper, the glimpse of who he truly was beneath the polished exterior. Judge Rhodess's eyes lingered on him. She knew what the jury now understood. Brent Maddox wasn't simply defending himself against accusations. He was unraveling. And with every witness, every testimony, the carefully constructed walls of his reputation were crumbling brick by brick. The storm inside the courtroom was no longer distant. It was breaking open, and everyone could feel its first drops of thunder. By the second week of the trial, the courthouse had become more than a place of law. It had become a theater of suspense. Every seat was filled, the gallery brimming with reporters, families, activists, and curious citizens. Outside, crowds gathered daily, holding signs, chanting for justice, or defending Maddox as a fallen hero. Inside, however, truth was tightening its grip. The morning began with the testimony of a forensic analyst, a meticulous woman with a calm, steady voice. She laid out inconsistencies in Maddox's reports, missing timestamps, altered entries, and evidence that had vanished under his supervision. Her explanation was clinical, but its implications were devastating. Officer Maddox, she said carefully, filed reports that contradict the physical evidence collected at the scenes. In several cases, key items of evidence, drugs, weapons, were signed out under his name but never logged back in. The jury shifted uneasily. Murmurs rose in the gallery. Maddox sat stiffly, his lips pressed into a thin line. He leaned toward his lawyer and hissed, "She's lying. All of it." His lawyer tried to calm him, but Maddox's jaw twitched with barely contained rage. Then came the breaking point. The prosecution announced a surprise witness. A man in plain clothes stepped forward, his posture uneasy, his face pale but resolute. The gallery stirred with surprise. It was Detective Aaron Calloway, one of Maddox's longtime colleagues. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Calloway raised his right hand, swore his oath, and then fixed his gaze on the jury. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as he spoke. "I served with Officer Maddox for over a decade. I admired him once, but I can't stay silent anymore. I saw him plant evidence. I watched him alter reports. I heard him brag that no judge would ever dare cross him." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Maddox's face turned crimson. He shot to his feet, pointing a shaking hand at Calloway. "Traitor! You're only saying this to save yourself." His voice thundered through the chamber, and the gavel struck again and again as Judge Rhodess demanded order. But Calloway did not flinch. "I'm saying this because it's the truth. Because people have suffered, and because justice has to mean something." Judge Rhodess leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but commanding. "Officer Maddox, sit down. Your behavior will not disrupt these proceedings." Maddox slammed back into his chair, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. His lawyer buried his face in his hands. The testimony continued, each word like a nail sealing the coffin of Maddox's defense. The jury watched intently, some with furrowed brows, others with eyes wide at the scale of betrayal being uncovered. For Judge Rhodess, this was the moment she had long anticipated. The veil lifting, the silence breaking. The system that had protected Maddox was being dragged into the light, piece by piece. And though the storm of his anger raged, she held firm. Because in her courtroom, truth was no longer a shadow, it was a weapon. The trial had reached its most volatile stage. The gallery was more crowded than ever, the air inside the Charleston Federal Courthouse thick with suspense. Every testimony, every piece of evidence had chipped away at Officer Brent Maddox's carefully constructed image. But what no one could predict was how violently his mask would finally shatter. Judge Vanessa Rhodess entered with her usual composure, the gavel striking to open the session. Her face revealed nothing, but she could feel the tension pressing in from all sides. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It was a battleground between truth and denial. The prosecution called a final civilian witness, a father who had lost his teenage son during one of Maddox's raids. His voice was steady, but laced with grief as he described the night his unarmed child was taken from him. "He kicked down our door," the man said, staring directly at Maddox. He never asked questions. "He treated us like criminals in our own home." The words echoed like gunfire in the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and the audience held its breath. Maddox leaned forward, his face darkening with fury. His lawyer whispered urgently, "Don't react, please!" But the words only fueled Maddox's defiance. He slammed his fist onto the defense table, the sound reverberating through the room. "Lies!" he shouted, his voice thunderous. "You all sit here pretending to know me, pretending to judge me, but none of you were out there. None of you faced what I faced." Gasps rippled across the chamber. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes fixed on him. Judge Rhodess struck the gavel sharply. "Order, Officer Maddox, control yourself!" But he did not stop. He rose to his feet, his voice growing louder, more unhinged. "I was the law in this city. Without me, half of you wouldn't even feel safe walking these streets. And now you—" His eyes burned into Judge Rhodess. "You think you can sit up there and decide my fate? You think you can strip me of what I built?" The courtroom erupted in chaos, spectators gasping, some shouting, reporters scrambling to capture every word. His lawyer tugged desperately at his sleeve, begging him to sit down, but Maddox ripped his arm away. His defiance had transformed into raw rage, a spectacle that no one could look away from. Judge Rhodess remained calm, her voice cutting through the uproar like steel. "Officer Maddox, you will sit down immediately or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Do you understand?" For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Maddox's chest heaved as he glared at her, his face twisted with resentment. The once polished officer who had worn medals and posed for cameras now stood exposed before the world, a man consumed by arrogance and fury. Slowly, with a venomous stare, he lowered himself back into his chair, muttering curses under his breath. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in that room understood what they had just witnessed. Not the strength of a hero, but the unraveling of a man who could no longer hide his true self. And for Judge Rhodess, the message was clear. The breaking point had arrived and the storm was far from over. The courtroom still buzzed with tension from Brent Maddox's explosive outburst the day before. Reporters filled the steps outside Charleston Federal Courthouse long before sunrise, headlines already screaming about the fallen hero's rage. Inside, spectators crammed into every seat, drawn by the promise of more fireworks. But what awaited them was something even more unsettling. The complete unraveling of a man who had once been untouchable. Judge Vanessa Rhodess struck the gavel to begin, her tone even but firm. "This courtroom will remain in order. Any further disruption will not be tolerated." She knew Maddox was dangerous, not because of weapons or violence, but because of his pride. His belief that the badge he once wore still made him immune to consequence. The prosecution resumed with documents, surveillance and testimony that exposed years of manipulation, falsified records, lost evidence, and victims silenced under fear. Each exhibit was another thread unraveling the fabric of Maddox's carefully constructed legacy. Maddox sat rigid at first, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward. But as the weight of the evidence mounted, cracks began to widen. He shifted restlessly, muttering under his breath, shaking his head violently as if refusing to hear. His lawyer leaned in, whispering, "Stay calm, Brent. We'll fight this on appeal." But Maddox's composure was gone. Suddenly, he stood, ignoring the judge's sharp call to sit down. His voice, raw and strained, filled the chamber. "You think this is justice?" He spat, his hands trembling. "You think this is about truth? This is a show! A performance for the cameras, for the reporters, for people who don't understand what it means to keep a city in line." The gallery froze. Every word echoed through the silence. He went on, pacing like a caged animal. You sit there pretending you know me, but you don't know what I had to do. You don't know the deals, the sacrifices. Do you think this city stayed safe on its own? No. His voice cracked now, desperation leaking through anger. We covered for each other. We protected each other, because without us, this whole place would collapse. Gasps rippled through the room. His words, meant as justification, became confession. Each sentence was another nail hammered into the coffin of hide fences. Reporters scribbled with urgency. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Rhodess leaned forward, her voice steady but commanding. Officer Maddox, you are admitting under oath to actions that directly contradict your testimony. Do you understand the severity of your words? Maddox laughed bitterly, his face twisted. Severity? You want severity? The only mistake I made was thinking any of you would understand. I was the law in this city. Without me, you'd all be nothing. His lawyer buried his face in his hands, but the power Maddox once wielded was gone. The jury no longer saw a decorated officer. They saw a desperate man unraveling, exposing the very corruption he had once hidden behind. Judge Rhodess remained calm, her gavel striking. Let the record show the defendant's statements. The jury will consider them. And with that, Maddox slumped into his chair, sweat on his brow, his breathing uneven. For the first time, he looked less like a warrior and more like a man defeated, not by others, but by his own pride and collapse. The mighty officer had crumbled in front of the world, and there was no undoing it. The Charleston Federal Courthouse had never been so silent. After weeks of testimony, fiery outbursts, and unraveling secrets, the trial of Officer Brent Maddox had reached its end. The air inside the courtroom was thick with anticipation as the jury filed back in, their faces solemn. Reporters held their pens ready, cameras clicked softly, and every spectator leaned forward. Judge Vanessa Rhodess observed the jury carefully. She had presided over countless verdicts in her 2 decades on the bench, but this moment carried a weight unlike any other. This was more than a case. It was a turning point, a measure of whether truth could finally stand taller than corruption. The 4 persons stood. On the charges of falsifying evidence, guilty. On the charges of abuse of power, guilty. On the charge of attempted intimidation of witnesses, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. Each word struck like a bell tolling through the chamber. Maddox sat motionless, his face drained of the arrogant fire that once burned in his eyes. He no longer appeared the confident officer or even the angry defendant. He was simply a man stripped bare, the walls of his power crumbled to dust. His lawyer sat beside him in silence, knowing the battle was lost. The last count was read. On the charge of corruption and conspiracy within the Charleston Police Department, guilty. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some clapped their hands over their mouths. Others let tears fall quietly. Families who had waited years for justice wept openly, clinging to one another. The reporters erupted in a frenzy, scribbling furiously, capturing the moment that would headline across the nation. Judge Rhodess lifted her gavel. Order! Her voice was steady, unshaken. She turned to the jury. This court thanks you for your service. Then her gaze fell on Maddox. The defendant is remanded into custody and will await sentencing. He will not be eligible for parole. For a moment, the courtroom seemed frozen in time. Maddox sat staring at nothing, his broad shoulders slumped, his hands shaking slightly. Once he had believed himself untouchable. Now his downfall was complete. The very system he had twisted for years had finally caught him in its grip. As marshals escorted Maddox away, Judge Rhodess felt a rush of emotions she rarely allowed herself. Relief, sorrow, and the faintest spark of hope. She had not only presided over a trial, she had witnessed the breaking of a silence that had weighed on Charleston for far too long. Outside, the courthouse steps overflowed with crowds. Some held signs demanding reform. Others cried tears of relief. News anchors shouted into cameras, capturing the historic verdict. Charleston has seen justice today, one reporter declared. But the question remains, will this verdict spark real change, or will it be remembered as just another trial? For Judge Rhodess, the work was far from over. In the weeks that followed, she called for the establishment of a civilian review board, ensuring that misconduct would no longer be buried under paperwork and silence. Community leaders joined her. Activists lent their voices, and slowly, a dialogue of reform began. Whistleblowers stepped forward, emboldened by Maddox's conviction. Hidden stories of misconduct surfaced, painting a broader picture of a system in need of cleansing. Painful truths were brought into the light, and though they cut deep, they were necessary to begin healing. The city itself began to change. Trust, once shattered, began to grow again, not quickly, not easily, but steadily. People looked at Judge Rhodess not only as a judge, but as a symbol of resilience, proof that justice could stand firm even when tested by arrogance, corruption, and fear. As for Maddox, his name faded from the headlines in time. The man who once called himself the law became a cautionary tale of how power without accountability leads only to ruin. On a quiet evening, weeks after the trial, Judge Rhodess stood alone in her chambers, gazing out at Charleston's skyline. The city lights flickered against the dark sky, and she thought of her father's words, that justice is never easy. Tonight, she understood them more than ever. The gavel had struck, the verdict delivered, but the story of justice was far from finished. Maddox's fall was not the end. It was the beginning of a long, difficult journey toward renewal. And as the city moved forward, one truth echoed louder than all the rest. Corruption could bend the system, but it could not break it, not as long as courage stood guard in its place. Ending words. In Charleston, the shadows had been long, but at last, the light of justice broke through.